So, can you tell your friend that speak on the computer? Okay, I hear him. I can hear him, so we are good, okay? Do you copy?
Hey, hello. Okay.
Okay, we are good. Thank you.
Okay, so sorry for the slightly late start, but we won't keep you too long. So yeah, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Oakley, and it's my honor to introduce this session, the 2026 SIGCHI Outstanding Dissertation Awards presentations. These awards celebrate the remarkable contributions of some of the brightest emerging scholars in HCI. Serving on the committee to select these awardees is always a pleasure. The dissertations are always genuinely inspiring. However, at the same time, the process is very challenging. I would first like to begin by acknowledging the 2026 committee. Ellen Du, Radu Daniel Vatavu, Sean Munson, Vasilis Kostakis, Mar Gonzalez Franco, Mary Gray, Paul Strohmeyer, and Gregory Aboud. Their work was incredible, huge amount of effort. This year, we received 32 dissertations in total from institutions across 4 continents and covering the full range and spectrum of HCI work. It's really incredibly diverse. We were able to select 5 awardees, of which 4 are present here today, and 1 will present remotely. We have about an hour and a half for this session, so we're going to have about 18 minutes from these awardees. They may leave some time for questions, in which case you're perfectly willing to ask them if there's time, but otherwise we're going to have to keep ticking through. So without further ado, I want to introduce our first awardee. So Dr. Sukran Karaosmanoglu Karaosmanoglu. This research pioneers immersive virtual reality games that promote physical activity, active aging, and social innovation. It addresses pressing societal challenges by combining technical innovation, inclusive design with older adults, including individuals living with dementia, and rigorous evaluation beyond the laboratory. This thesis is an inspiring demonstration of how HCI research can harness virtual reality technologies to create meaningful social and health impact. I would like to welcome Sukran to the stage.
Thanks for the introduction, Jan. Hi, everyone. Welcome to my dissertation's presentation of immersive virtual reality games for societal impact. I'm Sukran Karaosmanoglu. I completed my PhD at University at Hamburg last May, actually, and I'm currently working there as a postdoctoral researcher. So let's get started with the talk now. Societal challenges are complex issues that affect individuals as well as social systems, such as health, policy, and finances. Therefore, United Nations has Sustainable Development Goals to create a better global future. And within those goals, my dissertation research specifically focused on good health and well-being. With this goal in mind, as human-computer interaction researcher, I researched how immersive VR games can have a positive impact on society. But of course, you may ask, why VR games? These games combine fun, immersion, and special interaction possibilities. Instead of making your game character jump using simply a keyboard input, you can actually perform jumps in these games. They also provide opportunities for unrealistic scenarios and experiencing them. We also have a full control over the virtual worlds of these games and customize them according to the needs of users. Lastly, these games offer access to inaccessible activities. For example, playing games in person was not possible during COVID, but it was possible in VR. So given this potential, my dissertation targeted using immersive virtual reality games for societal impact. And accordingly, my dissertation was driven by overarching research question of how can immersive VR games support addressing contemporary societal challenges. Within the goal of good health and well-being, I focused on physical activity as a part of good health, active aging by particularly targeting the needs of older adults, and social interaction as an integral part of well-being. And I divided my overarching research question into 3 sub-research questions for each of the societal challenges I focused on. And each of them basically ask, how can immersive VR games support physical activity, active aging, and social interaction? In my dissertation, each targeted societal challenge included 4 articles, most of which were published at CHI and CHI Play, overall resulting in total of 12 research papers. And due to time constraints today, I will focus on 1 article per societal challenge, which I hope will also showcase the diversity of my dissertation. Now let's move on the specific challenges and start with physical activity. Insufficient physical activity is one of the major problems of societies. And for example, even we work in front of computers and move less and less. To combat this issue, creating enjoyable experiences is recommended. Therefore, I looked at XR games as a potential solution. In one of the publications which was published at CHI, we basically looked at the extended reality XR game research and design space, which is covering virtual reality but also augmented reality. To get a comprehensive overview of XR game landscape, we conducted a scoping review following the PRISMA guidelines for scoping reviews. To analyze the literature from an HCI perspective, we use the foundational framework of HCI, People, Activities, Context, and Technology PACT framework. And using and adapting this framework, we created research questions that are asking about objective of XR games, the user group that target, as well as exercises, design aspects, and technologies used in these games. And now let's look at together what we found. The average participant age for the studies ranged from under 10 to over 90, but most studies focused mainly on younger adults. In total, we had studies from 16 different reported countries, but over 72% of them conducted in Europe and North America. In total, we went through 158 user studies, but almost 80% of those studies let players to experience the XR games once. Next, we created a taxonomy of XR games, including multiple dimensions. And within these dimensions, we consider several aspects, such as target age group and health conditions. And lastly, we provided with a set of guiding questions that should help researchers to report the aspects of their games. And after providing such an in-depth overview of immersive games, we also showed the potential of XR games that incorporate personalized feedback and expert-driven design to provide vertical jump training. Next, focusing on the feedback aspect in detail, we explored how to provide real-time continuous cues to help players to correctly execute exercises. Lastly, we targeted the visionary goals of VR XR games, and we looked at how some specific game elements influence to do physical exercise and long-term use. And after addressing the physical activity, I focused on another societal challenge, which is active aging targeting older adults. Technological advancements are contributing to rapidly aging population, and this basically emphasizes the importance of supporting older adults to remain active, to have a healthier and independent life. Following the recommendations, here I focused on understanding the needs of older adults and designing as well as developing immersive virtual reality games for them. My dissertation's first contribution to this part investigated the design of age-appropriate exercises by involving older adults as well as movement experts. The next paper focused on a specific population within older generation, older adults with dementia. Here, we showed the importance of creating realistic experiences and using realistic interaction concepts for this population. After studying realistic scenarios, we also explored unrealistic interactions as a potentially effective approach to improve player motivation and physical activity. And in our last paper, which was published at KaiPlay, we focused on comparing two emerging XR gaming technologies for older adults. Let's have an in-depth look into this paper together. The motivation for this project was that previous research shows younger adults enjoy XR games and perform better when they play with the immersive technologies. However, older adults have different technological needs. First of all, they grow up in a non-digital world and they are experiencing age-related changes in their abilities. Recently, a lot of attention also has been put onto how to improve XR gaming experiences. For example, the XR Cube system that consists of 3 projection walls and a motion tracking system has been proposed to trait aspects like immersiveness and visual fidelity with high usability. And this system also has started to use in senior living facilities as well. Accordingly, focusing on 2 highly contrasting display systems, virtual reality head-mounted displays and XR Cube, we investigated the following research question. In the VR version of the game, we don't have audio, I think. We have an audio problem. Can we? Okay, no. In the VR version of the game, players were equipped with a head-mounted display to view the virtual world and wore 2 wrist-attached controllers to interact with the virtual objects in the game. And here you see that players collect some snowflakes, but we all, at the same time, we had additional levels that include more cognitive challenges in the game. And in the XR Cube version, players again wore the wrist-attached controllers, but this time experienced the game on XR Cube. So the same identical space, just they are seeing the game in a different display. With the game ready, we conducted a within-participant user study with 34 older adults. And looking at the results, we see that participants experience significantly higher presence in the VR condition compared to the XR Cube condition. However, interestingly, they moved significantly more in the XR Cube condition. When we look at the objective exertion, we see that both XR gaming setups led to significantly increased exertion compared to baseline measurement, but they were still comparable. So our main takeaway from this study was that, unlike younger adults, for older adults, higher levels of technical immersion might not be necessary, as it did not translate to higher player experience or performance. While the XR Cube demands more space and cost, it promotes greater activity and safety, whereas virtual reality head-mounted displays offer higher presence, simpler setup, and more affordable. That has been said, the benefits of virtual reality games are not limited to these focal points, which brings me to my final societal challenge that I will talk about today, social interaction. Technology is also transforming our social interactions significantly and dramatically. It can basically increase our social circles and support well-being very much. Therefore, in this part of my dissertation, I focused on improving the benefits of this digital transformation for social interaction. Since multiplayer games naturally involve multiple players, we first focused on understanding the asymmetries in the game design and between players. Based on our learnings, we investigated whether and which type of interdependence can support players with different interfaces. Further, we questioned if asymmetric VR games can be inherently social or can be affected by existing social ties between players. Lastly, we compared a virtual co-located gaming scenario with a real-life co-located gameplay. Let's look at this Sky paper in more detail together now. So we know that playing video games with others in person is a play mode that many players enjoy. However, access to such an experiences were quite limited during COVID, and virtual reality already offers some social and entertainment-related experiences today. Which leads us to formulate the following research questions and compare virtual co-located gaming scenario with a real-life co-located one. To simulate a couch effect in VR, we had an initial calibration step to have an identical positioning of physical and virtual couches. And afterwards, in the customization step, players customize their avatars with offered assets. And in the last step, players could sit by side on a virtual couch, like in a real world, and play a multiplayer game together on a virtual TV. And you can see some impressions from the multiplayer simulator and gameplay here. So basically, two players had to navigate a sphere through several obstacle courses and synchronize together. And after finalizing the implementation, we compared it a co-located condition where participants were in the same room and played the game on a single TV screen to a VR condition where they played together in VR but located separately in the labs. When we look at the results, we see that in terms of co-presence, players found significantly higher co-presence in the co-located gameplay in most of the subcategories. In terms of player experience, VR condition outperforms the real-life co-located play, which we connect to the decreased social cues in VR, enabling players to focus more in the gameplay. Overall, since both scenarios induced moderate to high experiences, we conclude that joint media consumption in VR works, and this scenario could be an alternative for face-to-face social gaming experiences. And we also note the technical limitations of VR hardware, such as limited field of view, that potentially affects the sociality in such scenarios. With these, I would like to provide a brief summary and conclude my presentation. The first part of my dissertation showed the importance and timeliness of using virtual reality games to support physical activity and presented several novel applications, such as expert-driven design of a vertical jump training in VR. In the second part, I targeted active aging, and here with our research, we showed that the importance of human-centered design when developing virtual reality games for older adults. Finally, with the research targeting social interaction, we demonstrated the potential of VR technology and asymmetric game design to facilitate social interaction between players. Overall, my dissertation creates a scientific foundation for societal impact. The various lessons and design guidelines are all highly relevant for developers, policymakers, and societal organizations. And these all play a crucial role for turning them into consumer-ready products that can make a meaningful societal impact. With this, I would like to thank my supervisor, Professor Dr. Frank Steinicke, my family, my colleagues, friends for their support. All are here. I would like to extend my thanks to BMBF, University of Hamburg, DAAD, Hospital zum Heiligen Geist for supporting my research, and of course, ACM and SIGCHI for considering awarding my doctoral work. Thank you.
I'm not sure that we currently have a mic available for questions. So if you have questions you want to ask, we're trying to source one now, but if you have questions you want to ask, I think our presenters will be around at the end of the session. So please come up and talk to them at the end of the session. Okay? So I think let's give Sukran a big round of applause one more time. Thank you. Humphrey, do you want to come up and set up while I introduce you? Okay, so our second presenter today is Dr. Humphrey Curtis. Dr. Humphrey Curtis's research reimagines how wearable, augmentative, and alternative communication systems can support people with aphasia through deeply participatory, co-designed approaches. This work addresses fundamental challenges in AAC by moving beyond a medicalized deficiency model towards an embodied framework that leverages wearable factors to promote agency, identity, and everyday communication. This work showcases how HCI research can reshape assistive technologies and meaningfully improve lives. And so we're just setting up the audio for this now, and then Humphrey will take it away in a moment. Okay, so let's welcome Humphrey to the stage.
Is it projecting? Okay, great. Just the opening slide? Okay.
To the stage one final time. Thank you.
Yeah, cheers, Ian. Thank you so much for those really generous comments. Great. Hi, everyone. My name's Humphrey, and I'm from King's College London. I have the pleasure today to talk to you about my thesis, Wearable, Discrete, Augmentative, and Alternative Communication. I was supervised by Tim, who's proudly in the front row, and Rita. I couldn't have done it without both of them. So I don't have many formal guidelines for this talk, so I'm going to keep it fairly informal and reflect on my PhD journey. I'll share some of the key ideas, findings, and moments that stood out for me along the way. So what is AAC? Well, augmentative and alternative communication, or AAC, refers to any methods and technologies that can be used to support or replace speech for people with communication difficulties. These can range, as you can see from the above image, from low-tech boards and switches to even high-tech tablets, apps, and even now, AI. To give you a better impression, here is an advert of the most popular AAC, a Prolo-Quo2Go app running on an iPad. It has about 10,000 daily active users and almost 1 million downloads. Hopefully this works.
Being nonverbal doesn't mean we can't speak. We want to show you who we are, anywhere and anytime.
Cool. So that gives you a good impression of what AAC is. So now turning to the community at the center of my thesis, people living with aphasia. Aphasia is an acquired language disorder, most often caused by stroke, that affects reading, writing, speaking, and comprehension. In the UK, around 500,000 people live with aphasia, and it's a non-visible disability. Amongst the wider public, it remains not very well known, but this documentary from Channel 4 did a good job of raising some awareness. My thesis research was deeply participatory, with the community and their lived experiences shaping the design of technologies throughout. Encouraged by my advisor, Tim, I spent 4 years volunteering weekly with a local charity, Aphasia Reconnect, in London. This meant working closely with Londoners with aphasia from diverse backgrounds, and of course, being British, making plenty of cups of tea. It's important to recognize where this thesis was done. London is a fast, dense, and highly populated city. Much of everyday life happens on the move, especially on public transport. That means communication is often taking place in noisy, crowded, and high-pressured contexts. These lived realities really shaped the AAC devices we created with the local community. On the whole, AAC adoption is very low for communities with aphasia. Some noted problems with AAC devices include that they tend to be quite expensive, difficult to customize, and cause a lot of public stigmas. As I showed you earlier, AAC is predominantly large tablet devices. This form factor restricts body gestures and is not very portable. Aphasia is also generally acquired later in life following a stroke, which means many people with aphasia are older adults who may lack experience with technology. Many are also managing this long-term condition whilst relying on health services that are under significant pressure, which means it's very challenging to deploy AAC within these contexts. So to begin my PhD, I embarked on a systematic review of the field. Over about 9 months, we analyzed over 500 AAC papers, spanning 5 decades of research. So there's clearly a significant corpus, but we found a surprisingly narrow design space. One of our main findings was that most AAC systems are still largely designed as grid-based tablets, where users select symbols through touch to produce spoken voice or synthesized outputs. The focus is almost entirely on verbal expression, and many of the methods tend to be quite medicalized and reparative, a lot like the device I showed you earlier. Human communication is obviously much richer than just speech. There's still very little AAC for nonverbal communication. Furthermore, only a small number of studies actually involved people with disabilities like aphasia in the actual design process. The use of proxies was concerningly far more common. During this process, I also came across some very influential studies and thinkers. For example, in the 1970s, people with aphasia were taught to communicate using Amerind hand talk, which shows that gesture can really function as an effective language. I also found the work of Charles Goodwin, which I think is genuinely amazing. Put bluntly, he refused to give up on his father's post-stroke communication abilities. He argued that people with aphasia are still rich, expressive, and multimodal communicators. During my initial studies with people with aphasia, we asked about their communication challenges, and this video powerfully captures what many described. So as you just heard, communicating in places like the London Underground is very hard with a non-visible disability. It's often impossible to signal the need for a seat or assistance from others. This reflection emphasizes that any AAC must understand the real-world context of use and that it should recognize and support people's own sense of voice. In a later Kai paper, we even created vignettes of our key co-designers to better understand what empowering communication might mean to them. To give you an example, here is Brian, an ice cream van driver who communicates using his whole body, gesture, posture, pacing, his speech, even his clothing and love of Arsenal football tops. When he struggles, he fills gaps with gestures or photos on his phone. He's not passive, but actively using many language resources to communicate at all times. These vignettes hopefully reveal that people with aphasia communicate in ways that are adaptive, embodied, and deeply tied to the context in which they're in. So how do we design technologies for this? Instead of having to solve this difficult question myself, we used accessible co-design approaches to empower people with aphasia to create wearable and discrete AAC for their own difficulties and needs. At the start, co-designers built several low-fidelity wearable AAC prototypes across different form factors, including smartwatches, badges, pendants, and phone-based tools. What was really interesting is that these initial wearable AAC designs weren't just about speech production. They were about navigating different everyday contexts. Also, the technologies look quite different from the earlier AAC tablets I showed you all. Some of their functionality included asking for help from strangers, communicating interests, a love of the local football team, the Eagles, self-regulating communication anxiety, or non-verbally disclosing your disability and aphasia to a stranger. Building on these findings, in my next study, we then honed in on the smartwatch as a way to augment and support communication. What interested me about the smartwatch was its more positive social connotations than a traditional assistive technology. A smartwatch is generally associated with health and fitness rather than disability, and yet prior work had largely overlooked it as a communication tool. Consequently, we co-designed a range of smartwatch features with people with aphasia, recognizing the potential for this accessible device. So, as the demo just showed you, some of these features on the smartwatch were public-facing. We called these watch out. For example, turning the smartwatch into a small outward display that could be shown to others on the go. Other features that we designed in the smartwatch were more private. We called these watch in, including prompts and mindful breathing to support and help manage highly contextual communication anxieties. What emerged was the idea of the smartwatch not as a replacement for communication, but as a discrete safety net that could support communication when needed. In the words of Patrick, it was great to have the confidence to fall back on it if my fluency drops. The smartwatch is a really good safety net. Following the smartwatch, we then explored another form factor, the smart badge. Once again, preliminary co-design was very fruitful, and people with aphasia designed lots of exciting ideas. Here's a quick demo of the AAC badge prototypes we built. So yeah, there's my quick demo. Anyway, many co-designers liked the idea of having a small wearable display pinned onto clothing designed strictly for communication in public settings. They also really liked using their beloved smartphone as AAC because of the ease and familiarity of using this existing technology. Importantly, we were trying to design tools that avoided interrupting people's conversational flows and instead supported their gestures, eye contact, and more natural communication resources. To summarize some thoughts from co-designers, the long battery life of the e-ink display was really popular, and the e-ink was quite nostalgic, reminding Emmanuel of his old Nokia phone. And Hannah liked the ability to clip the e-ink display onto her lightweight crossbody bag, considering she lives with bodily paralysis and hemiplegia, so it's very difficult to carry something heavy. We also wanted to look to the future and ask what emerging technologies might mean for AAC. So in this study, we explored 3 future-facing prototypes. Here's a quick demo again. Okay. I am trying to get it. Oh. So, as you just saw, the first prototype, Pico Project AAC, allowed us to project communication props into the environment. Prompt AAC, which I didn't have a video of, offered private or wearable audio prompting. And the final one, Holo AAC, was a mixed reality wearable AAC prototype. What was exciting here is that participants could co-design, imagine, and test new technologies, projecting maps into shared space, hearing prompts discreetly, or accessing contextual support via the headset in the moment. In terms of positives, projection and audio showed really great potential to support shared co-constructed communication, but our co-designers quickly identified the limits. The mixed reality headset elicited overwhelmingly negative reactions around its accessibility, visibility, privacy, and cost. Fundamentally, it caused too much cognitive load. As Roland stated, this is too overwhelming. For a person with aphasia who's just had a stroke, it would be hard to control. It would make you rather frustrated. To close, I want to return from the high-tech wearable AAC prototypes developed within my thesis to something much simpler, but in many ways just as powerful. Over 4 months at the end of my PhD, we studied Zhang's self-made communication diary, a deeply personal AAC tool and very bespoke tool which she built for herself and her unique expression, including her love of swearing, as you can tell from the title. Zhang's AAC and diary wasn't necessarily polished or commercial or high-tech, but it was a diary full of drawings, notes, memories, colors, and things that really mattered to her. And that was exactly the point. The diary gave her the agency to express herself. A notable thing about the diary was that you could physically give it to other people to initiate conversations, and Zhang could flick through the diary, allowing her subtly to control the pacing of conversations if they became too fast. The diary supported storytelling, humor, memories, self-expression, and connection with others. It can be handed to someone, explored together, and used to co-construct meaning. And reflecting back on all the prototypes we built throughout my thesis, the watches, badges, mixed reality systems, Zhang's diary was really an important reminder that AAC does not have to be technocentric or expensive to be powerful. It just has to be personal. So stepping back, there are 4 main contributions from my thesis. First, this idea of reframing AAC, not just as something that outputs speech, but as something embodied, multimodal, and shaped with other people. Second, we expanded the design space through wearable and more discrete form factors, with badges and smartwatches most positively received amongst our community. Third, we showed that in everyday life, what really matters is confidence, discretion, nonverbal communication, and a lot of partner awareness. And finally, this work definitively shows that people with aphasia can really meaningfully shape technologies through accessible co-design. With the blessing of his family, I'd like to dedicate this talk to Gareth Jones, who very suddenly passed away earlier this year. Gareth was a really valued member of the Aphasia Reconnect community and took part in so much of my PhD work, as well as supporting countless other researchers at King's, City, and beyond. He was incredibly generous with his time, always willing to educate others about aphasia and offer really honest feedback. He's deeply missed. Thank you very much for your time. I'm happy to take questions. Great.
There is a microphone now available, so we can take a question if you have one. Please make yourself known to the SVs.
Hello. We have the microphone. Okay.
I cannot see anything.
Yeah, I know. You kind of get quite a lot of light.
Okay. While we are waiting for questions, can I ask Martin?
Sure.
Martin.
Okay.
Hi, Humphrey. Thank you for the great talk. Inspired by the last work that you talked about with the diary, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about inspiring people with aphasia and other sort of similar disabilities to develop their own solutions to help with these AAC challenges kind of coming from the bottom up rather than as opposed to the other sort of tech solutions that you're doing in a more participatory fashion.
Yeah, that's a really terrific question. I think if we could give people with aphasia the confidence to design their own tools for themselves, that would be really amazing, right? Because building a technology for yourself, you're empowered in that process, and you have hopefully total control over the technology, how it works for you in your daily life. And ultimately, that's kind of reconstructing your own sense of voice. So I think that's super beautiful, and also, would be really ideal if we could inspire people to develop and do that. Ultimately, Zhuzhena was slightly an outlier, right? There are many people that we interacted and worked with who wanted more off-the-shelf tools, so those definitely still have a role. But hopefully those off-the-shelf tools always remain customizable, meaning that people can customize them however they like.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Let's thank Humphrey one more time. So the third awardee in our session is Dr. Martin Feick. We're just having another swap. You just bear with us a moment.
Aquí en teoría sí que lo está reconociendo, pero... Sí, pero a mí me está duplicando, pero si no me lo llevo allí yo. Ya lo había hecho, pero tú lo vas a hacer. Okay, so we have a change in order of presentations. We tested, but apparently not well enough. So we're going to switch and do our fourth awardee in the third place and have Martin come back in a moment. So Eunkyung, could I get you to come up? I'm sorry for the change of schedule. Okay, he'll put it up in a moment. Okay, so our third presenter today, our third awardee, is Dr. Eunkyung. Eunkyung's dissertation critically examines the real-world deployment of AI within health infrastructures. It combines a large-scale LLM-based chatbot for public health monitoring with design inquiries into clinical support for tapering antidepressants. Rather than amplifying technological hype, the work carefully evaluates both the promises and limitations of AI systems. It offers grounded evidence-based design strategies for responsible integration. It stands as a thoughtful example of how AI can be studied and designed with rigor, care, and a deep sense of societal responsibility. Let's welcome Eunkyung to the stage.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. I'm deeply honored to receive this Outstanding Dissertation Award and to be able to share my PhD work with you today. So again, my name is Eunkyung. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Computer Science and Engineering at Postec in South Korea. So, and I lead the Health and Human-Computer Interaction Lab. I earned my PhD from the University of California, Irvine, where I was advised by Dr. Daniel Epstein. During my PhD, I was a Google PhD Fellow, and I also won the Best Paper Award at KITE 2023. So let's dive into the main part of the presentation. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, many countries around the world actively adopted digital technologies to trace the movements of confirmed cases and their close contacts. However, although US is often regarded as a global leader in information technology, the adoption and uptake of digital contact tracing technologies were much lower than in other countries. Obviously, it wasn't really due to a lack of technical capacity. From the early stages of the pandemic, multiple state governments and major tech companies like Google and Apple quickly developed digital contact tracing applications. However, in most states, adoption rates remained below 10%, which made it very difficult for these systems to achieve the intended impact for public health. So public health experts pointed out that the low uptake was due to a lack of centralized public health system that can give consistent guidance across states. So this example highlights the importance of designing technology that aligns with the human infrastructure in healthcare settings to ensure its effective real-world implementation. So Charlotte Lee defined human infrastructure as organizations of human labor required for collaborative work. Human infrastructures in healthcare settings involve multiple stakeholders, including but not limited to care recipients, healthcare professionals, insurers, pharmacies, government agencies, and tech companies. Among different types of technology that can be beneficial for healthcare, my research has particularly focused on personal tracking technology. Many people today use mobile apps or wearables to track aspects of their health and well-being, such as their physical activity, sleep, food, and mood. Lee et al. Define such technology as personal informatics systems, or systems that help people collect personally relevant information to engage in self-reflection and gain self-knowledge. While research on personal informatics has long focused on individuals' practices, tracking practices often happen in collaboration among different stakeholders. When personal health tracking is incorporated into clinical care, it can assist clinical decision-making by empowering patients to more effectively communicate their symptom experiences. Personal health tracking also has the potential to assist public health interventions by extending public reach, by automating aspects of the data collection. Like other types of health technologies, integrating personal health monitoring into clinical care or public health interventions requires aligning with human infrastructures. Unfortunately, the role of human infrastructure is often overlooked in the design and adoption of health monitoring technologies. To address this gap, I proposed the following thesis statement through my dissertation. Health monitoring technology that accounts for infrastructure complexity can improve collaboration in clinical care and public health interventions. So my dissertation presents findings from 4 different studies that examine how health monitoring technology can better support collaboration in clinical care and public health interventions by accounting for the infrastructure complexity. So for the sake of time, I'll only focus on the 2 studies relevant to the thesis claim 2 on public health infrastructures, and then discuss broader implications of my work at the end. Toward thesis claim 2, Care Goal Stakeholder Study examines how health monitoring technologies might support stakeholder practices within public health infrastructures. So this study was around multi-stakeholder perspectives on a large language model-driven chatbot for public health monitoring, which I looked at the perspectives from the care workers and the older adults, the care recipients, and as well as the tech developers. So this work was presented at CHI 2023 and was recognized with the Best Paper Award. In this study, I examined the case of Caracol, an LLM-driven chatbot developed by Naver. So the goal of this system is to collect data about socially isolated individuals, general health, and serve as a conversational partner to mitigate their loneliness. So this system has been deployed widely across dozens of municipalities in South Korea in the form of scheduled checkup calls since 2021. Through focus group workshops and interviews with multiple stakeholders, I learned that these LLM-driven chatbots open-ended conversations provided frontline workers with rich contextual information about the users and mitigated the socially isolated individual's loneliness by supporting conversations on diverse topics, including their hobbies and interests. And despite these benefits, I observed some serious challenges in leveraging LLM-driven chatbots for public health monitoring. The main challenge was expectation management around the system. The open-ended nature of the interactions often made users assume that the chatbots can do anything government-related, and government agencies similarly assume that the chatbot can take on any public health tasks. However, because of the inherent uncertainty in controlling the dialogue flow of LLM chatbots, the developers could not accommodate such requests, like connecting to social services or incorporating specific questions to check medication adherence, etc. So this finding highlights the significance of understanding multiple stakeholders' needs when designing these chatbots for complex healthcare settings. And also, toward the thesis claim 2, public agency study delves into public agency perspectives on leveraging AI chatbots to scale up care within public health infrastructures. So in the study presented at CHI 2025, I examined whether the AI chatbots fulfill the public agency's expectations around scaling up care in reality through interviews with public agency workers in multiple roles relevant to the adoption and rollout of CareCall, the LLM-driven chatbot. So through this study, I found that AI chatbots primarily fulfill the expectations around expanding public reach to a much larger population. However, AI chatbots fail to deliver on the expectation of scaling up monitoring reach with minimal human labor. As decision makers overestimated AI's capabilities in public health monitoring, they failed to plan for the human resources required to operate AI at scale, placing significant burdens on existing workers to manage the expanded care. In addition, CareCall's introduction demanded frontline and administrative workers to take on new types of labor, particularly around handling lapses in user engagement. So through this work, I found that the adoption of AI chatbots to large-scale public health monitoring is likely to introduce expectation mismatches. Specifically, the open-ended nature of LLMs likely fostered unrealistic expectations around what they can offer. So this highlights the need for developing guidelines to help decision makers better estimate the human efforts necessary to operate AI at scale. And this study further showed that frontline workers had to take on new types of labor to address lapses in user engagement due to some expectation mismatches around user engagement. The adoption of the chatbot operated under the assumption that people would consistently and willingly engage with AI chatbots in the context of public health monitoring. But in reality, users frequently lapsed in the use of CareCall because they simply forgot about it or they just did not want to interact with AI. To improve AI adoption for large-scale health monitoring, developers need to pay close attention to the types of tasks AI could add to existing workers and how such work can be better recognized and addressed. So let's discuss some broader implications across studies by revisiting the thesis claim 2. So toward my thesis claim 2, I argue that amplifying existing practices is essential for health monitoring technologies to meaningfully support collaboration in public health infrastructures. In the CareCall stakeholder study, I found that public health monitoring technologies like AI chatbots can enhance frontline workers' practices of manual checkup calls by providing a holistic understanding of care recipients' daily lives. Such information might have been difficult to obtain through human-only approaches, given the workers' resource constraints. And AI chatbots also supported individuals' existing practices of participating in social isolation interventions, by engaging in broader conversation topics, which also might have been difficult through human checkup calls given their resource constraints. In the public agency study, I found that AI chatbots enabled scaling up care to significantly larger population compared to human-only approaches. This work also showed that AI chatbots could scale up public agencies' efforts to connect individuals with necessary healthcare or social services, as the open-ended nature led users to express various public service needs. And insights from this work suggest that public health monitoring technologies can play a meaningful role in care infrastructure by surfacing unmet care needs among vulnerable populations. My dissertation also revealed tensions in amplifying existing practices of stakeholders in public health infrastructures. A key challenge is managing stakeholder expectations around system capabilities, especially when those technologies are designed to support open-ended, flexible forms of interactions. Through the care call stakeholder study, I found that stakeholders often held misaligned expectations around what LLM-driven chatbots could accomplish. So the open-ended nature of LLM-driven chatbots often led stakeholders to assume that the chatbot could perform a broad range of tasks, while developers struggled to meet such expectations given the technical constraints. These mismatches complicated efforts to integrate the technology into existing practices. In the public agency study, I observed a related tension around expectations around human labor. Decision makers often assume that the chatbots would operate efficiently with minimal staffing. However, in practice, introducing AI requires significant human efforts, particularly to handle lapses in user engagement. This discrepancy led to inadequate workforce planning to operate AI at scale, leading frontline workers to take on a significant burden. So taken together, I argue that adopting AI systems requires fundamentally rethinking and reconfiguring the existing practices involved in public health monitoring. So before I wrap up, I'd like to thank some crucial people in my academic journey. So first and foremost, I'm deeply grateful to my PhD advisor, Daniel Epstein. And I also thank my committee members, Yunan, Stephen, and Young-ho. And I also want to thank all my mentors, collaborators, and friends who have supported me throughout my academic journey and who continue to do so. This work would not have been possible without the support from the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, Naver AI Lab, and Google. And last but not least, I'd like to thank my first batch of students at the H2CI lab at Postdoc for celebrating this meaningful moment with me. So that concludes my talk. Thank you so much.
Okay, so we have a few minutes for questions. So if you have a question, please find the SVs. They have a microphone, and then we will take questions for a few moments. Eunkyung, one more time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Laptop is there. Okay, thank you for waiting. I think we're just about resolved. So let me introduce our next awardee. Our fourth presentation today is Dr. Martin Feick. Dr. Feick's dissertation advances virtual reality haptics through a coherent and technically ambitious exploration of hand-based perceptual illusions, combined with innovative proxy hardware and adaptive personalization. Grounded in rigorous psychophysics, the work moves beyond device engineering to systematically investigate how haptic cues can be shaped, sustained, and understood within multisensory interaction. Meticulous in execution and clear in vision, this work strengthens our understanding of multisensory integration while expanding the design space for accessible, high-quality haptic experiences in virtual reality. Martin, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Ian. Very sorry for all the technical difficulties. I'm not sure what is going on, but I got some help, so thanks again for the backup computer. I hope that will work out, but we will see in a second. So I'm truly honored being here today. And I would like to start my talk with the famous words, "Seeing is believing," which capture the idea of my dissertation to make use of our very strong visual sensor modality to create experiences that allow humans to communicate, to play, to collaborate, or train in simulated 3D environments. And one way to achieve this is by using virtual reality, in which users can immerse themselves by wearing VR glasses that can render stereoscopic, that means 3D images. And while these environments are visually realistically rendered, let's take a moment and closely look at what happens when this user reaches out to touch a virtual object. She reaches right through it, because in fact, there's nothing to be touched. So this absence of haptic feedback for hand interactions is a fundamental problem and can really disrupt the immersive experience. And one way to address this problem is passive haptics, which uses physical stand-ins, often referred to as proxies, for virtual objects in the environment. So in this example, a virtual bottle of champagne, which I guess we can open tomorrow evening, hopefully, is substituted by this 3D printed proxy bottle. So the ultimate goal of proxies is to resemble as many physical properties of virtual objects as possible that are relevant to the user's interaction. So for example, the bottle's shape, size, weight, maybe even function. But passive haptics in itself is rather inflexible. So just imagine you would need one proxy for each of the virtual objects that this user interacts with. You would basically end up physically reconstructing the virtual environment, which defeats the purpose of VR. And this is where hand-based illusions come in, which manipulate what users see from what they feel. So in this example, we can see a redirected touching illusion that uses one belt-shaped proxy in the bottom right corner and maps it to virtual belt shapes of different heights and inclines. And this really feels like you're touching the yellow object in VR, but how does this work? So one method to achieve this is by manipulating the CD gain factor, where C stands for control, so what the user does in the real world, and D stands for display, what the user sees in the virtual world. For example, a CD gain of 0.5 slows down the virtual hand by 50% during hand reaching, as illustrated here. So in the redirected touching illusion that we have just seen, this was the vertical offset. However, this results in a sensory mismatch between the visual and the proprioceptive, so what we feel sense, leading to the question, where do we perceive our hand to be? Well, up to a certain threshold, vision tends to dominate over proprioception, which is pretty cool because we can sort of like trick the brain into believing that we touch different virtual objects, even though we interact with the same proxy. But to what extent does this mismatch remain unnoticeable? And what haptic illusions can be achieved? So this brings me to the overarching research question of my dissertation, where we explored the boundaries of unnoticeable hand-based illusions to enhance haptics in VR. So we split our work into 4 research questions, starting with designing proxies that can change their kinesthetic and tactile properties for hand interactions. Next, we focused on the design of hand-based illusions that expand the scope of proxy-based interaction while remaining unnoticeable to users. Then we look at the factors that impact their noticeability. And finally, we propose a novel method to tailor hand-based illusions to user sensitivity to offsets. And obviously, this is way too much content to cover in 15 minutes, and therefore I selected 3 projects that I believe are sort of like representative for the work that I have done throughout my PhD. Starting with how can we design proxies that can change their kinesthetic and tactile properties. So in the project on the right, we focused on changing the perceived tactile properties of surfaces through actuation of 3D printed metamaterials. So metamaterials are a special class of materials that deform uniformly across their surface by being stretched or compressed. And this is possible because of their design, where in our case, every second pillar inside the material can freely move upwards. So if we compress the material, as you can see on the right-hand side with the device that we built, the features emerge evenly across the surface. And the idea is really to design materials in a way so that they can change their surface texture through compression, combining them with visual materials to enhance tactile perception in VR. To inform our metamaterial designs, we looked at the 5 psychophysical dimensions of tactile perception, and we decided to focus on hardness and softness and coarse roughness, as metamaterials appear to be most promising for manipulating these dimensions. So we produced 5 metamaterial designs for hardness and roughness, which we fabricated with an off-the-shelf FDM 3D printer using TPU filament. And each of these metamaterials allows for 4 actuation states, resulting in a total number of 20 metamaterial states. And I can promise you they feel very different from how they look like. So in the next step, we actually wanted to understand if these mechanical differences also translate to perceptual differences. And to do so, we conducted a preliminary lab experiment where we asked participants to explore materials using their index finger without seeing them, so they were blindfolded, and rate their hardness and roughness on a 7-point Likert scale. Following our analysis, we identified material 1 and material 4 as the most promising designs, which we then used in our main study to investigate how adding visual texture overlays affect roughness and hardness perception of our metamaterials. So we selected 6 visual material textures, differing in roughness and hardness, but this time we also assessed the similarity between the visual and the metamaterial texture. So participants assessed the haptics only of the metamaterials, the visual roughness and hardness of the 6 visual material textures, and all visuo-haptic combinations. And our results showed that adding visual overlays can actually shift users' perception of hardness and roughness of a metamaterial, demonstrating that a single metamaterial through actuation can act as a proxy for various visual material textures in VR. However, this was only the case when the metamaterial and the visual texture had high similarity, so multi-sensory integration effectively fused the sensory inputs. In contrast, when the metamaterial and the visual texture were perceived as too different, the illusion became noticeable and as a consequence broke, with haptics dominating. So we took these results as a motivation to investigate how hand-based illusions can be designed that remain unnoticeable to users while still allowing us to change their perception. So the motivation was to design hand-based illusions that overcome the physical motivation of proxies. And today I would like to show you one of our techniques, rotational pseudo-haptic resistance, which we create by visually slowing down users' real-world rotations of a knob. So this can be achieved by, again, applying a CD factor, here 0.5, to the rotation of the virtual knob. And as a result, a user's hand needs to rotate further to reach the target, which actually translates to the perception of physical resistance. But how did we achieve this? So in the first step, we needed to understand how much CD gain between the rotation of the physical and the virtual knob can be used while remaining unnoticed. So here we repeatedly exposed participants to CD gains of different magnitudes, and their task was to detect when the CD gain was applied by responding to this forced choice question either with yes or no. Participants' responses were then fed into an interleaved staircase procedure, and there's actually quite a lot I could say about this, but for the sake of time, it's a common psychophysical method that lets you compute an individual's detection threshold, which refers to the point when a user starts to notice the offset. So our results show that on average, we could slow down the movement by 33% without people noticing. Next, we looked at how much CD gain we actually need in order to change the perceived physical resistance. And therefore, we determined a just noticeable difference in resistance, and this time participants performed 2 consecutive movements, one with a 1-to-1 mapping and one with a CD gain applied, but the order was randomized. We then asked participants to compare both movements in terms of their physical resistance. But please note, the actual physical resistance was always the same, so participants were only rating the effects created by the CD gain factor. And our results show that small CD gains can change the perceived physical resistance, and even more interesting, within the range of unnoticeable CD gains. So I just want to emphasize this again. We can change the perceived physical resistance while the participants do not notice that we apply a visual manipulation. So this is pretty awesome. At least I think it's pretty awesome. And finally, we wanted to understand how CD gains correspond to actual physical resistance. And here participants switched between two knobs, one with a red and one with a blue dot. And the goal of the task was to adjust the actual physical resistance of the red knob using the up and down arrow key. So there was a motor inside actually, so that it matches the resistance of the blue knob. And the results yield that with decreasing CD gain, participants selected significantly higher resistance values, which actually allowed us to fit a model for rotational pseudo-haptic resistance using forced fusion, enabling designers to apply our findings to any rotational movement, regardless of the lever, in order to predict the perceived torque on the applied CD gain, or vice versa. And finally, I'd like to show a couple of examples of how and where rotational pseudo-haptic resistance can enhance proxy-based interactions, even beyond knobs. So for example, a door handle with different resistances, or also in bimanual setups, such as steering wheels, without requiring strong actuators. And just to give a quick outlook in our second project, we introduced visual-haptic translation that was established using a similar method. And here we designed a technique that allows remapping virtual sliders of different lengths to a single physical proxy slider, as you can see in this video. And again, this was achieved by scaling up or down users' manipulations of the slider by using unnoticeable CD gains to render the haptic limits of the slider. And together, our techniques enable haptic support for interactions with 3D UIs that host multiple virtual knobs and sliders with varying physical properties. However, we notice large differences between individual users in their tolerance to these offsets, suggesting that thresholds are not fixed values, but highly flexible, which results in the need for a method that allows continuous monitoring and dynamic adaptation of the applied offset. Basically, how can we personalize illusions? Which we explored in our last research question, focusing on the well-established hand-based illusion hand redirection. And in the project on the right, we investigated specifically horizontal hand redirection, which gradually offsets the position of the virtual hand from the position of the real hand during hand reaching, as you can see on the right. Our goal was to determine when a user starts to notice this offset using implicit data. So in our case, this was interaction data or hand movements, eye gaze, and EEG, so signals from the brain. As we know that detection thresholds are highly individual, we designed a two-part experiment. So in the first part, we determined each participant's perceptual boundaries by fitting a psychometric function to their hand redirection discrimination results. Then we extracted distinct perceptual points. So the point of subjective equality at 50% probability of detection. So here it's pretty much random if a user can detect hand redirection or not. The detection threshold at 75% probability, and these two are commonly used in the literature. We also chose 25% as a value below the detection threshold. So once we established these perceptual boundaries for a user, we moved on to the second part of the experiment, where we only exposed participants to hand redirection offsets corresponding to their perceptual boundaries, collecting total movement time, the transition between ballistic and correction phase for hand movements, for eye gaze, the number of hand fixations and their durations on the hand, and for EEG, we specifically looked at ERP, so error-related potentials, at the frontal cortex. Looking at our results, we found that movement time and transition points can be used to distinguish between different magnitudes of horizontal hand redirection. For our eye gaze features, two eye gaze features, both of them showed significant differences, especially between baseline at and above the detection threshold. However, the effect was in the opposite direction to our hypothesis, so future work needs to look into this. We also looked at ERP negativity and found evidence suggesting that we can distinguish baseline movements from movements under the influence of hand redirection. However, we could not find evidence that would allow us to differentiate between hand redirection of different magnitudes. So finally, we also combined all three modalities by training a 4-stage multimodal classifier using random forest just out of the box, achieving an overall prediction accuracy of about 40% for all 4 classes based on a single movement. And while this doesn't sound impressive at first, we need to take into account that we are talking about small changes in hand redirection magnitude around the noticeability level of users. So I still believe there's great potential in this, but of course more research is needed here. So this was an overview of 3 projects out of my dissertation, which brings me to the contributions of my thesis. So first of all, we provide technical contributions by presenting 4 novel proxies that can render kinesthetic and tactile haptic effects. Further, we contribute to the design of 3 perceptually validated hand-based illusions, one of which I showed you today. We provide theoretical knowledge about the role of various design factors in visual proprioceptive conflicts, and we propose a novel method to predict individuals' detection thresholds based on implicit user data. In addition, we also develop a wide range of use cases and applications, showcasing how our techniques can be applied in VR applications. And we also open source most of our hardware and software and 2 data sets that emerged from research question 4. I'd also like to highlight 2 systems that I'm personally very proud of. The open source VR questionnaire toolkit, which allows the research community to collect data in VR experiments, which received incredible positive feedback and is still widely used, and the Museum of VR Illusions, where users can try famous VR illusions, because it's often difficult for people who have not experienced illusions themselves in VR to grasp how effective they really are. And together with my collaborators, I've also investigated novel redirection algorithms that utilize plinks and saccades to hide offsets. And I've not only looked at haptics for the hands, but also for users' feet, where we investigated the use of sole-attached material textures to create slipperiness sensations in VR. So I'm the one who's standing here today, but of course this would not have been possible without the support of many people. So to all of you who have been part of this journey, some of you are here today, thank you very much.
Time for 1 or 2 questions. If you have a question, please come up, find the microphone.
Hi, Martin. You probably can't see me, I'm on the left, that's fine. David Lindelbar, Carnegie Mellon. Super cool body of work. There's a number of papers I really like. I'm wondering if you could talk about the influence on primary task and kind of all the different measurements that you take, right? If people perform attention-demanding other primary tasks, a lot of those values are likely going to change, and depending on the task, right, there's a lot of different vectors that come into play here, and I'm wondering what your kind of, after multiple years of investigating that, what your thoughts are first on accounting for that, but also just how to actually measure that and get all those different data points in this vast space of possible parameters.
Yes, thank you, David, for the question. Great question. So especially the last study is heavily affected by the task, because we tell people to look at their hand to detect these offsets, right? And then we also notice that this, of course, also changes their eye gaze behavior quite significantly, because usually you don't look at your hand when you perform interactions, you look at the target, right? And that's also one of the biggest limitations of my dissertation, if you will, because if you don't look at the illusion, it doesn't work. So that's, of course, a downside. So we also would need to consider that in the interaction design, that if you apply any of the techniques, it needs to be in a situation or interaction where you actually pay active attention to the hand. Considering the second part of the question, whether how we could actually measure this, so I think at some point you actually need to measure this in real-life VR applications and have people actually do realistic tasks and not the simulated tasks that we have or had in the studies, in order to see how this actually plays out in the field then, and whether, for example, the classifier, just talking again about the eye gaze data that we have, would still work. I would be quite critical on that part, to be honest, in retrospect, because we just need to see if that actually has the power that we found in the signal when we had this very constructed scenario.
Okay, in which case, so we're still dealing with our final talk, but let's thank Martin once again. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you.
Our final awardee and presentation today is on Zoom, so again, we are just setting that up. Give me just 1 second to introduce you, and then you're on, okay? Okay, so our final awardee today is Dr. Ben, what was that? Is Dr. Ben Zhang. His dissertation offers a rare and deeply human-centered examination of how value is produced within global AI data infrastructures through multi-sided ethnography in difficult-to-assess environments, including data labeling factories and state-directed data exchanges in China. The work reveals how AI systems are built upon forms of professionalization, precision labor, and emerging data marketplaces. This dissertation provides a rigorous and timely socio-technical account of a global AI supply chain, shedding light on the human foundations of contemporary AI. So we are hopefully just about ready to show this. Yes, I think it's good.
It's a real honor to be here. My dissertation is titled Infrastructure and Data Values, an ethnography of AI production, labor, and the data marketplaces in the Chinese data by state. The central question for this work is, how does data become valuable technically, economically, and politically through the entanglements of professionalization, labor, and governance? In this talk, I share what I found when I embedded myself inside China's AI and data infrastructures, the annotation centers, training programs, and data exchange that make AI system possible, but largely remain hidden from the view. In developing regions across China, returning youth were being trained and certified as AI trainers, a new profession tied to promises of rural revitalization and upward mobility. Workers at AI data annotation centers were meticulously labeling voice clips, images, and documents 9 to 6, 6 days a week. And the data products were being circulated, priced, and traded across China's emerging data marketplaces. My method is multi-sided ethnography. I conducted 39 in-depth interviews with key stakeholders, including AI trainers, data brokers, engineers, policy analysts, and lawyers, alongside hundreds of informal conversations essential to understanding these regions and infrastructures. My data draw from multiple sources, including field notes, policy documents, technical standards, training materials, and news articles. China is an ideal site for this work. In 2020, the State Council officially designated data as a new factor of production, alongside land, labor, and capital. This makes China one of the few places in the world where data infrastructure is not just an industry story, but a national development strategy, giving us a real window into how states actively shape the conditions under which data become valuable. This vision has given rise to an ambitious national project, a national data infrastructure designed to unleash the value of data as a factor of production across the entire data lifecycle. It spans regional, sectorial, and enterprise-level infrastructures, all coordinated by the state and technology companies. Over the course of 3 years, I conducted both online and in-person fieldwork, including a 12-month of in-person fieldwork in China. I participated in 3 professional training programs. I also attended major industry conferences and worked as intern at one of China's largest AI data annotation centers for over 2 months, 9 to 6 days a week alongside my interlocutors. Throughout, I disclosed my position as a researcher from a US institution, remained attentive to power dynamics and my own positionality. I followed a grounded theory approach and used the situational analysis to make sense of the data. To make sense of what I found, I developed infrastructural valuation as a social, technical, and relational process through which economic, moral, and epistemic values are produced, stabilized, and legitimized within the emerging infrastructures. Specifically, I draw on following bodies of literature. Scholars of infrastructures have framed infrastructure as fundamentally social-technical, labor, material, historically situated, flexible, and continuously reconfigured. Additionally, they have emphasized its relational nature. That is, infrastructure is not neutral or universally experienced, but is deeply entangled with social relations, local hierarchies, and political dynamics. In particular, I find the valuation study helpful because the term valuation encompassing both the moral sense of value and economic value. Scholarship in valuation studies often centers its inquiry on valuation as a social practice and studying valuation as a process. And from the study of professions, I draw on how credentialing, certification, and expertise function as devices of legitimization. For instance, valuation devices such as credentials and performance metrics function as tools for legitimizing professional authority. Bring these scholarship and my multi-sided ethnographic fieldwork together while in conversation with the fields of STS, HCI, and China studies, I develop infrastructural valuation as a lens to study values in the making within emerging infrastructures. I argue that an infrastructural approach to valuation reveals how value is not merely economic, but also symbolic, political, and socio-technical, produced and contested through professionalization, labor regimes, market devices, and governance. And the infrastructural valuation shows how data infrastructures do not merely support the production and circulation of data, but actively produce its value. Now let me turn to 3 studies of empirical work. In the interest of time, I will mostly offer high-level arguments and takeaways. So the first study examined how AI trainers, a newly created profession in China, are recruited, trained, and certified. The work largely overlaps with data work that provides machine learning data sets. I first argue professionalization function not as a worker empowerment, but as a regime of symbolic valuation in my context, legitimizing AI trainers through credential and narratives rather than material gain. Specifically, I trace 3 dynamics: enrollment, narrative construction, and worker precarity. Workers were positioned as valuable contributors to the data economy, yet systematically denied epistemic authority, career stability, and collective bargaining power. Training and certification function not as a preparatory tools, but as mechanism of valuation, enrolling individuals into the infrastructure while aligning their aspirations with state and corporate goals. Eunkyung, one of my key interlocutors, had recently returned to his hometown in Shanxi, a coal mining region, reinventing itself as a hub for green technology and digital industry. He wanted to work from home, care for his aging parents, and escape factory work in the city. The program promised all of that, but was the training and certification delivered with symbolic inclusion, not economic security? And these promises were often deeply gendered. I observed the promotional slogans from technology companies like, "I can't let my child become a left-behind child too," having her by my side, giving me peace of mind. These narratives echo what scholars like Mo describe as the affective dimension of labor, particularly care work. But here, they are rechanneled into the technocratic framework of data and AI production. Together, professionalization serves as a mechanism of valuation, one that leverages institutional discourse, market logics, and effective narratives to stabilize emerging data infrastructures. Building on LinkedIn's incubating human capital, I show how this model extends entrepreneurial logic into under-resourced regions, aligning worker aspirations with state and corporate goals while naturalizing the cost workers bear. Study 2 takes us inside the AI Annotation Center, where we examine how technical accuracy as a prevailing value was perceived, established, and managed on the ground. We argue technical accuracy in AI training was not simply a target to meet. It becomes a site for what we call performing precision labor. Precision labor is a hidden, excessive, and increasingly machine-subordinate labor involved in erasing the messy, ambiguous, and uncertain aspects of AI production to present technology as objective, truthful, and high quality, even when this pursuit is excessive or harmful to workers. Technical accuracy is managed through four mechanisms: excessive training, standardized workflow, hybrid management, and machine verification. I will focus on machine verification, where clients deploy automated system as an additional layer of evaluation, and where those systems holds enormous perceived authority. Workers told me that algorithmic evaluation carried significant weight in determining accuracy. When quality checkers were uncertain, they deferred to the system. As you see, an interlocutor explained, they would rely on machines to test and ensure the desirable outcome. What the machine says is what it is. We tend to go along with whatever it suggests. When I suggested that accuracy decision should be machine-driven, accuracy decision should be human-driven rather than machine-driven, my comment was met with a prolonged silence. This study conceptualized a distinct yet underdocumented aspect of digital work as precision labor. It also highlights machines as a new source of epistemic authority in AI training. Precision labor can be extended beyond data production to enrich broader theoretical discussion on labor issues in areas such as content creation. Through the lens of infrastructure evaluation, this study also shows how data's value is not inherent but enacted through actors, standards, and managerial practices that translate human judgment into machine-compatible inputs. Study 3 shifts from AI production to data marketplace. Valuation here is fundamentally about assigning economic worth to data. Gen AI demands vast amount of training data. To meet this demand, companies are increasingly turning into data marketplaces globally. In this study, I examine how the economic value of data is enacted within China's emerging state-directed data trading infrastructures. I argue that China's state-directed data infrastructure serve multiple strategic objectives, responding to anxieties about economic slowdown and data security while promoting a broader data-driven model of development and governance. This continues a long-standing pattern. Like many states in the majority world, the Chinese state deploy large-scale infrastructure to manage economic instability, and the consolidated political authority now extends to the data governance. This can mean state-owned data exchange that set pricing standards, certification regimes that determine who can legally trade, and compliant requirements that give state more visibility into data flows. In this context, valuation becomes a mechanism of governance. The data trading infrastructures enable centralized control while projecting the promise of economic stability. This study contributes to the political economy of data by showing how the Chinese state uses infrastructural interventions to materialize data's economic value while simultaneously consolidating political authority through new forms of data governance. Together, these Studies reveal how data value is socially and economically produced across distinct yet interconnected social-technical contexts. I define infrastructure valuation as a social-technical and relational process through which economic, moral, and epistemic values are produced, stabilized, and legitimized within the emerging data infrastructure. Infrastructure valuation captures the form of valuation work that inherently infrastructural. As global concerns over AI risks and governance grow, infrastructure valuation can potentially offer some intervention. It shifts the question from what values AI systems should align with to how value itself is produced, negotiated, and materialized across AI's lifecycle, recentering the material and the relational dimension of infrastructure that shape how AI technologies are built, valued, and governed. This enables critique of responsible AI discourse that tend to overlook infrastructure inequality, structural violence, and state interventions. The labor dimension of infrastructure valuation reveals how digital labor communities sustain regional and global tech economic agendas, often invisibly and at personal cost. Such work has direct implication for social policy and labor management practices in AI production and deployment. Finally, infrastructural valuation advances a lifecycle-centered approach to AI, one that attends to the everyday situated practices through which labor, expertise, and harm are made visible or rendered invisible across AI's development, deployment, and governance. It draws attention to the mechanism that silently determine who participates in value creation, under what conditions, and at what cost. Importantly, it reframes AI governance not as downstream regulatory problem, but as a distributed infrastructure challenge across the entire AI lifecycle. I'm excited to continue this line of work at the intersection of professionalization, labor, infrastructure, and responsible computing. I'd like to close with gratitude. This work was only possible because of the generosity of my interlocutors who shared their time and their stories with me, as well as their expertise. And the funding, I'm grateful for the funding support from the International Institute, the China Center, and the Rackham Graduate School at the University of Michigan and the Weizenbaum Institute. I'm deeply grateful to my advisors, Dr. Oliver Heimson and Michael Len Thomas, and the committee members, Dr. Sophia Lintner, David Rebais, Kara Wallace, and to my collaborators, Tianling Yang, Mila Masili, Pele Tracy, and Patricia Garcia, as well as my friends, my partner, and the family. Thank you. I'd be happy to take your questions. And I know due to technical issues, I might not be able to take questions, but again, thank you for being here, and I'm really honored.
So yeah, it will be very difficult to take questions. We're not set up for that. So with this, I think I would like to thank all of our awardees, our 5 awardees, one more time. And then if you want to speak to any of the 4 that are present, please, I think they're all still here. You can come down to the front. So let's just thank all of our awardees one more time for their huge achievement. And I think we're done. So thank you for coming. I hope you enjoyed the presentations.